Xuanji, Unsold Peonies. Facing the wind, I sigh over the flutter of falling flowers. Fragrance silently fading away along with another spring. Because of their high prices, no one asks for the peonies, and their too strong scent keeps butterflies off. Their red blossoms should only grow inside the palace. How could their green leaves be tainted by street dust? When their roots are transplanted to the imperial garden, young lords will regret lacking the means to buy them. So we continue with Xuanji's poems. This one today, Mai Zan Mudan, Unsold Peonies, is quite an interesting piece. It's an example of what gets to be called in Chinese Jungushi, that is poems on objects. And poetry on objects usually has, like a lot of classical Chinese poetry, at least two layers of interpretation and meaning, or usually that is the objective. So on the face of it, these poems are meant to be read as an accurate description of the object that is being depicted in the poem. But at the same time, these objects that are described in these poems are usually imbued with the subjectivity, the emotions, the feelings of the poetic persona. So they are meant to double both as objects to be described and as a substitute or as a representation for the poetic persona and the feelings and the emotions of the poetic persona. Those are the two goals in traditional Chinese poetics of Zhongwuxi. And well, we will comment it in a minute, but this poem seems to achieve both goals to a pretty high degree. A few more things. So, first thing, this poem is, like the other ones that I am reading, a translation of Jihua. Wait a minute. It's a translation from Yinhuajia. And it's also interesting to indicate that it's a heptasyllabic regulated poem, which seems to have been the form that Xuanji preferred in her texts, in her choices for the forms of her poems. So we're going to go with it in a minute. We will just state now that subject matter is, as we've stated, double. On the face of it, this poem just describes how somebody, probably the poetic persona, a woman in early spring, is looking out at a market where peonies are being sold. Peonies were really expensive, luxurious flowers, and they were really beloved in the Tang era, where gardens with peonies and gifts of peonies were considered like the acme of refinement. And, you know, they collected really high prizes, and sometimes they were stolen from the gardens of, there are poems on this, on peonies being stolen from the gardens of Buddhist monasteries and taken elsewhere because of how appreciated they were. And lots, well, there's a previous poem I've read in this series, I think, which was about peonies. So, having said this, we can go to the poem couplet by couplet. Again, these are long lines, heptasyllabic, so each couplet is pretty long. We could almost stop in each line, but we're going to go couplet by couplet. First couplet. Facing the wind, I sigh over the flutter of falling flowers. Fragrance silently fading away, along with another spring. So the first couplet puts us in time and place as usual. Remember the title just told us Unsold Peonies. The interpretation of the title could be talked about as well, like the translator indicates that this is usually mistranslated as wilted peonies, but really from the context of the poem and from other uses in other poets, unsold peonies is the better phrasing here. So the first couplet places us in time and space. So we are in some moment in spring. Peonies blossomed and reached their height in late spring. That was when they were sold in the capital. So the poetic persona is facing the wind and she sighs. Of course, it's late spring, the end of the season of love. There are falling flowers and their fragrance is fading. Spring is ending again. Remember, spring is the season of love, but in classical Chinese poetry, along with autumn, it gets to be privileged as the season in which poems are set. And it acquires this tinge because usually the natural correlate of spring, the season of love, is lovers being united. That, Chinese poetry tends to prefer the melancholy and sad tone. This is a simplification, but in general, scholarly Chinese poetry tends to favor this melancholy sadness over, consummation and fulfillment. So you've got the season of love, but separation. And even if this poem is not explicitly or strictly about lovers being separated, it does add that tinge of melancholy at passage of time, loneliness, whatever. Important to say, the falling flowers with the fading fragrance are not the peonies. Remember, peonies flower in late spring. So we have to imagine the poetic persona in Chang'an looking at other trees, maybe willows, maybe cherry trees, maybe plum trees. Their blossoms are scattered, their scent is fading away. So this is the background. Yeah? The fading of the flowers, the fading of beauty, the fading of the passage of time. And again, you could implicitly, if you want, read it as hinting very, very, ever so slightly at the poetic persona herself, as, a beautiful young woman who also experiences the passage of time. Second couplet. And again, first couplet usually sets the background and then we start zooming in. That's very typical in these poems. So we zoom in, second couplet. Because of their high prices, no one asks for the peonies. And their too strong scent keeps butterflies off. So like the first couplet indicated sight, falling flowers, and fragrance, this gets translated rather in the sense of displaced to a new type of flower which is not wilted. So the zoom goes from the background trees losing their petals and their scent to the peonies that are on sale and probably in the splendor of their bloom. They're expensive. Remember, peonies were a really luxurious item in Chang'an. But they remain unsold. They're super expensive and also perhaps a bit intimidating. Yeah, not only because of their high prices. This couplet also tells us that they have a really strong scent. So they're superb flowers. Again, we have to read this as not only beautiful flowers are for sale, but the poetic persona is also a gorgeous woman who perhaps is not getting the attention that she thinks she deserves. Remember, Taoist priestesses were, as opposed to what later stuffy Confucian morals of the song would imply, they were not courtesans, but they were women with a relatively high degree of freedom and the ability to engage in amorous relationships, even if not in marriage. So there is probably an element here in which the poetic persona is, hinting at, I'm a really valuable person intellectually and physically. I'm not getting the attention I deserve. I'm a luxury item. Okay, third couplet. The third couplet just continues the second couplet. The second couplet gave us scent and price. The third couplet is going to give us the visual elements, which, in a way rhyme with the ones of the initial couplet. The red blossoms should only grow inside the palace. How could their green leaves be tainted by street dust? Very good example of parallelistic couplet. Red blossoms, green leaves, grow inside, be tainted. Palace, street dust. So a very well-crafted parallelistic line. And yeah, the main idea is the same. These flowers, these peonies are too valuable, with wonderful scent, with wonderful bloom, with wonderful colors, and they're not for the common herd. And so finally we reach the last and fourth couplet, which, as usual, summarizes the content and sometimes the spirit of the poem or the feelings of the poetic persona in a clear-cut aphoristic form. When their roots are transplanted to the imperial garden, young lords will regret lacking the means to buy them. So the poetic persona projects her vision of these peonies that are unsold because they are, too expensive and too high quality for the common crowd, and says in the future these flowers are going to be taken to the imperial garden, and then those who were foolish enough not to buy them will regret not having purchased them. Again, two levels, like this could be a real incident with real flowers that will be transplanted into the gardens of the imperial palace, but it's also very obviously the poetic persona of Yu Xuanji, who believes in her own worth. She is priceless and deserves to stay only in the noblest of places, whether it be the imperial palace in the capital, or remember, she's a Taoist priestess, perhaps the heavenly palace, that is, the Taoist immortal world. And so the poem concludes with this note of, you would call it defiance. And yeah, it wraps it up perfectly well. It's a delightful poem. It's charming and witty in those two types of readings that one can project into it, and a very good example of Yu Xuanji's talents at their peak.